Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Rome discovered the Americas. The chances were not that low that Rome could actually discover the Americas, and the geopolitical situation would also allow it on many occasions. But there were times where Rome would not be able to afford such an adventure. The discovery would most likely be made by a private group of persons at first. Rome was also never really comfortable at the sea, and this is a very known fact, which would be a huge handicap for such a scenario. Rome traded with China and India. Roman vessels also reached Indochina. So there was no reason to accidentally bump into the Americas. But what if all of that changed? What if Rome discovered the Americas? A few things need to be addressed at first. Let's say that at the end of the 1st century BC, before Christ, there would be a very good time for Rome to have made such a discovery. Because Rome was expanding, Rome started to control almost all of the Mediterranean, and Rome also started to control some parts of the Atlantic coast. Moreover, since the 1st century BC or even earlier, trade with the island of Lanzarote, which is in the Canary Islands, could be proven and is nowadays considered a fact. Now, if we have someone who had, let's say, more the spirit of an adventurer, explorer, and it would be very easy for him to discover or just go and trade with the other inhabitants of all the Canarian Islands, and maybe there would be a chance to even discover Madeira and Cape Verde. I think the Azores, they would be still too far. Rome traded with India, and if the Romans liked sugar, or they would have some taste for it, the Canary Islands and Cape Verde would be ideal spots to do so, and this would only happen because in this alternate scenario, Parthia would suddenly start to not allow Roman vessels to go until India and China, which would of course mean war with Rome and Parthia, but because Parthia and Rome, they had already a lot of wars, this wouldn't really change the geopolitical situation in the east, but it would change the predisposition whether they would like to go more to the Atlantic or not. The Romans could feel thus motivated to sail across the Atlantic with the idea that even though the sea would be very big and huge, they could still reach India or maybe even China. They would build somewhere in the Cape Verde a port and protect it in a similar way as they protected ports around Arabia, and they also built some important ports in nowadays Yemen. Brazil would be the first territory the Romans would discover, but of course they will not just immediately conquer it. The expedition would report back to the emperor, and probably more expeditions could happen. Rome would not plan yet to establish colonies or cities in Brazil, but they would make a port and they would try to continue their search for India, because they would still think that, oh, okay, the earth is much smaller, and they were already in India or maybe even China. And they would start to explore the northern parts of Brazil, the Caribbean, until they realized that this is not India, but it's something totally different. Fast forward, we could have two options. The ports and the settlements, they would disappear. And then they would be rediscovered in a similar fashion as they did so with the Viking settlement in Newfoundland. Probably most people would, in science, until a certain time, argue that Columbus would be the first to discover the Americas, but then they realized that you had the Vikings and then even the Romans in Brazil. But of course, this is a very uninteresting scenario, so I will move towards the second option. The Romans, they would then suddenly have, a very successful colony, a very successful port, successful settlements. They would bring iron weapons, horses, and a wheel. Then they would start to get Brazilian wood, because the Brazilian wood was considered very precious at the time for the Portuguese, who went there to establish their presence, and they used this wood or timber to build very performant ships. So maybe the Romans would do the same. Then, of course, until they get to the Caribbean and maybe parts of Mexico, they would suddenly also find gold, or maybe get gold through trade with the natives of the Amazonas, who would themselves get gold from the Andean states. We would have a very different diet in Europe very early on. We would have crops like potato, maize, tomatoes. Although potatoes, they were not yet very established in the Andean societies, so it would most likely take some more years until the potatoes would be considered really good crops. And I think maybe for the other stuff, even pineapple for instance, it might take also some time, but it would most likely come much earlier into European diets. The diet in Europe would change some parts of Europe. We would have Gaul, Belgica, Germania, and even Britannia, who would be very successful into growing their own stuff without getting things of Egypt or the breadbasket that was considered Sicily, for instance. So within Roman Empire, this would change certain things drastically, and I think that we would have also much earlier on some more population boost within the Roman Empire. But I will come to this point a bit later. The natives in Brazil could now trade much easier in the Amazon, because they would have the wheel. Mocha people would have a chance to consolidate once they get their hands on iron weapons, the wheel, and also horses. And they would have an easier chance to use horses, at least in the coast. A few Carib kingdoms would be established here and there, and I think the biggest winner of such a trade would be Teotihuacan. Why? Because Teotihuacan, they could use the horses especially in the north of nowadays Mexico, and they could do so in the most formidable manners. The Roman colonies would grow and expand, but without over-expanding too much. Some natives, they could Romanize or Latinize, giving a very different meaning to this term of Latin America, while others would be conquered. The Romans, they had not this policy of just exterminating everyone. They actually gave to some of their allies and some people they deemed civilized in some way a chance to become Roman citizens. And because also this colony would rely on more people from the outside of the Roman Empire, I think that there is a chance that they could become a bit more tolerant with these policies, at least in the colony. Yes, diseases, they would still come and do bad things in the Americas, but the natives, I think, they could quickly recover, and the Romans would not focus that much on colonizing itself. They were not so thirsty into getting gold like the Spanish, and they also had to deal with other problems like the barbarian invasion. They also had themselves problems with the plague, and their economy was not really in such a great shape, so we could still see a collapse as in OTL, but with immigration to the Roman colonies in the Americas, But with the introduction of potatoes, maize and the other crops, I think the population would be a little bit similar, only with the difference that in the Americas we would now have a change of the population. The Americas would become very different. Teotihuacan would become the big power, conquering the Mayans and going all up until the Rio Grande, even more forwards, thanks to the horses and the wheel. The Guarani could establish themselves as Mongols or Huns of South America for some time, fighting the American Romans, while the Navajo could at some point also become the same type of threat to Teotihuacan as were the Huns to the Mongols and as were the Huns to the Romans, and later on the Mongols to the Middle-aged Europeans. Moche at one point could be stopped, because they were very, very cruel. I mean, they just killed and chopped the heads of their enemies, and they kept their heads around their belts. So I think that a coalition of Nazca and Tiwanaku could beat the Moche in the long run, and maybe Nazca could be replaced by another empire that used to be there in Peru, the pre-Incan. But since it is very much argued whether there was an empire or not, I would just stay with Nazca, as they would be the most recognized and the most established culture. So, and having access to the coast would mean that they could also somehow use the horses a bit better and also do more things with the ships, whereas Tiwanaku would be too much in the mountains. They would have a good defensive, but they could not really go into the coast or the jungle, so they would be blocked. Teotihuacan would still collapse as in OTL. The Mayans could rise to power again, and the Navajo as well. So a Mississippi kingdom and culture would also arise, because with all the trade that is done and the contacts that they would most likely have all with the American Romans or the Caribbean people, or the Taino, this would be a very good case scenario for them. While the American Rome would lose some territories, but also move towards the north, getting more consolidation around the northern territories of Brazil, having a lot in Venezuela, or what we call nowadays Venezuela, the Guayanas, the Caribbean, and even after the fall of Rome, they would have extensive contacts with Cape Verde, Canary Islands, until the Muslims or the Spanish would take these islands, or even the Portuguese. At this point, it would be unclear what would happen with these islands, but I think that this necessity to trade would still be there, and most likely there would not be this curiosity to go to the Americas, because, well, there would already be a power, it would be a pretty strong one, and it would just take too much time and too much money to go there, too many ships. So I think the Muslims, as well as the Spanish and the Portuguese, at first they would just keep to themselves and solve their own issues. So European history would be much similar as in OTL, except until a certain time period, of course, with Columbus and all of that. The Americas would simplify Teotihuacan or Mayan symbols into a writing system, while most of South America would use Latin, except for modern-day Peru, where maybe some type of Quipu writing system could be established, or maybe where the Quipu stories could be codified. The Americas could be on par with Europe, Asia, the Islamic world, or even be more advanced, depending on how all of this would change them. Because with more empires, more kingdoms and so on in there, and also very different climates and also extensive contact networks, there is a chance that all of these concurrents would even give them a lot more technology. In the far future, Europe would have problems with overpopulation. That's the first thing. Frequent civil wars would be the results of it. Also, a lot of famines would happen. While in the Americas, the Romans could potentially annex the Guarani, bordering only the Nazcan Empire, Amazonas, and the ocean. The post-Teotihuacan Empire could expand again into the north and probably be some sort of China that was conquered by the Mongols, but they would be absorbed into Chinese culture. So in this case, the Navajo culture would not really exist, or just in their homelands, while the Navajo people that conquered Teotihuacan would be absorbed into this culture. And the Mayans, they could become an ally to Rome, so we would have some type of balance of power in this region, together with the Mississippi Kingdom or kingdoms. Numerous cities, tribes, states could have been founded in all of North America, so it's very unclear what would happen in there. The Vikings may be able to have a successful port city or even a colony, depending on the situation, or they would actually have a very unsuccessful adventure in there and just be slaughtered by the natives who would be more advanced. So the American culture, or the American culture is very difficult to say. It would be a mix of Roman Greco culture, but with a very strong influence of the native cultures that existed in there. And I think this Greco-Roman influence would of course be very, very dominant in the parts where we have American Rome. But even so, some things they would extend to other cultures, like a writing system or certain technologies or even philosophies, certain ideas, because these things, they are never bound to a border. Whereas certain ways to live or to make things happen within the society, yes, they are more bound within a border. We would also have a more polytheistic America. We would not have a monotheistic America. And this America would not resemble at all to Europe or Northern Africa or the Middle East. The population would surely be more native, except within American Rome, where we would have still some more white people, but we would certainly see also a huge number of mixed people and still a majority of native population that within themselves they would speak Latin and they would consider themselves to be citizens, loyal citizens of Rome. Maybe this new Rome would one day go into an adventure into taking back certain parts of Europe, saying that this belongs to them. If this would happen, they would be probably very successful, as the Europeans would be too divided, and this would be an alternate sunset invasion. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.